Hi, I'm Jenna Green, and I'm here with B. Young, and we are here to discuss two books that we read. The first book being Dying While Black by Vernelia Randall.
And Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare by Dana Bowen Matthews.
So the first thing we're going to discuss are three overarching themes that we found in the books, and they are unequal treatment and outcomes in healthcare, implicit biases and systemic racism, and inequity in healthcare is a result of the history of this country which stemmed from slavery. The first central theme that we found in each of these books that is really a key takeaway and serves as sort of the foundation for the relevance and importance of the things to follow that we will speak about is really the unequal treatment and outcomes in healthcare between Black and white Americans. So Black Americans have poorer health outcomes than white Americans regardless of socioeconomic status, in that they have lower life expectancies, higher infant and maternal death rates, lower birth rates, and higher death rates due to a myriad of illnesses and diseases such as cancer. And there's less access to care and poorer quality of care than white people. So even when that care is available, first of all, they have a harder time getting it. And when they do get it, the care is just not as good as it is for white people. So the next central theme that we're going to discuss is systemic racism and implicit biases. And Vernelia Randall describes systemic racism as the basis of individual and institutional racism. It is the value system that is embedded in a society that supports and allows discrimination.
So implicit bias are a sort of microaggression that falls within the system. And these are our unconscious thoughts that are based on our backgrounds, experiences, and environmental contexts. They are deeply ingrained into our brains and help us categorize information to help us make sense of the world around us. By doing this, it shapes the way we think, our perceptions, and judgments of others, as well as situations. Therefore, these create our realities, right? And our thoughts that essentially drive our behaviors as well as our actions, which affects the way that what we say to others and how we treat others, specifically those of different races and or cultures that are different from our own. So it's people's implicit bias that largely contribute towards the disparities in healthcare today, and was specifically talked about in both of our books. It specifically influences the way that healthcare providers interact with patients and delivers care to minorities just based off of an initial look. Without knowing any background information about a person, they are instinctively going back into their implicit bias and their unconscious awareness of past memories and past associations that their brain is innately doing. Right. As a result of people's implicit biases, people's eye contact is affected, and the way that people believe conversations and descriptions about one's health conditions or symptoms, and the way that not only the patients are describing their symptoms and the way that they interact with physicians, but it's also the way that the physicians are also interacting with the patients that ultimately are all getting affected.
Right, B. And everything that you were saying that was discussed in your book really ties back into what Vernelia Randall was saying, in that these implicit biases and these individualized roles that people have within the healthcare system help support and uphold institutional racism.
So our third overarching theme after discussing both of our books was the inequality in healthcare, which is a result of the history of our countries, which essentially stemmed from slavery. And there's evidence that shows this inequality in healthcare that dates back to the colonial period. There were things like property laws, slave codes, and other non-health related contributions, which legally enforced minority discrimination that laid foundations in creating this unequal, unjust, and unfair systemic issues. And during slavery, the American judicial system had even enforced property laws, which gave white Americans and white Europeans complete and inhumane control over the health care and living conditions of their, quote, Black slaves.
Right, and this history of slavery can now be directly traced to Black health today. And going back to slavery, Black Americans suffered demoralizing physical and mental conditions, lack of health care, and emotional and physical violence, along with basic neglect. And the legacy of slavery persisted until the 1960s and then assumed the form of institutional racism, in which illness and poverty became new forms of enslavement. So now, with these new illnesses and poverty as new forms of enslavement, racism really erects barriers to healthcare. And Vernelia Randall talks about this a lot in the sense that there are institutional policies, practices, and procedures that prevent Black Americans from having access to quality healthcare. And as Bee was saying earlier in our second theme, that some practitioners tend to provide different medical treatment to Black Americans based on race. And this is due to those implicit biases, but it has historical roots in that Black Americans and Southern medical institutions really limited care, and they didn't have access to care, as Bea mentioned earlier, when they were slaves because they were seen as property. And to quote Vernelia Randall, she said, "A significant contributor to an equitable health treatment of Black slaves was the medical profession's scientific support of the concept of racial superiority and inferiority. Physicians defined slaves as biologically different, in part by inventing slave diseases." So physicians literally invented these diseases to explain things that they saw in Black Americans and their slaves. And one of those being when slaves tried to run away, they created a disease and named that. And it was basically a way to confirm those biases in that Black Americans were inferior to white Americans. And so it was really physicians who assigned social meanings to the perceived differences of people who were Black and gave those assignments scientific legitimacy. And so that has led to severe distrust in Black Americans
So,
today.
uh, Dana Bowen Matthews had suggested a couple different ways to improve health and welfare of individuals. And I keep going back to this major theme and this overarching theme of implicit bias. And I think it's really important to preface that it surrounds us. It's unavoidable, right? And I think a common theme between both Jenna and my book was that like there has to be a social shift. Like this needs to happen, right? And however, in order to make any improvements on a macro scale, first, it has to happen on a micro scale. And one way to start facilitating these changes is to work on social norms that are associated with these implicit biases. So by acknowledging and accepting that these biases are real and that we all have them is the only way that any type of change can even begin to happen, right? So in Just Medicine, Dana presents a three-type intervention plan to reduce implicit biases and learn to respond to more appropriate attitudes and beliefs, right? So in type A, she had suggested to reduce implicit biases by intervening before stereotypes are subconsciously activated. So this explicitly like puts it out there, discussing about the motivations for these biases and ways to counteract them. And in type B, she suggests that interventions that introduce strategies after implicit biases are already formed. And this can basically reduce negative attitudes through positive reinforcements to counteract those existing negative stereotypes. So, or an example that she had suggested, was really pertaining to African American celebrities and or any person in power. Like the fame that comes with like being in a position of power, these people really do they can really make a a pretty big impact. Lastly, in type C of this intervention, Dana describes the methods which are introduced after implicit biases are formed, but before these biases influence one's judgment and or behaviors. So this basically acknowledges that like suppressing any negative biases essentially just doesn't work. Another way to improve health and welfare is to implement an implicit association test into the medical board certification exam to help decrease implicit bias and the tendency of medical students following maladaptive mistreatments they witnessed during their education. Another suggestion is to make a revision to the Title VI law so that people are more aware of unconscious and conscious biases and are held accountable for both. By putting laws in place, it keeps people more accountable for their actions. Thus, we'll have an overall social acknowledgement of what implicit biases are and how they impact everyone. These laws ultimately will force people to be more socially conscious of these implicit biases and have repercussions for their actions should they not choose to abide by these laws.
Renelia Randall also suggests some areas where changes can be made to improve the health and welfare of Black Americans. And firstly, this includes eliminating pre-existing inequities in disease, illness, and death, assuring access to quality health care, and also eliminating racial discrimination in healthcare and in health research. More specifically, we can mandate a livable wage for all workers, eliminate environmental hazards, and stop tobacco and alcohol companies from targeting Black communities. So assuring livable wages goes beyond minimum wages in that we'll provide people the opportunity to afford better housing, improve their nutrition, and receive higher education, all of which are associated with overall greater health and welfare to the extent of increasing life expectancy. Black communities are also disproportionately affected by environmental hazards, either through hazardous waste landfills in their communities, lead poisoning in their homes, or working jobs with greater environmental hazards. So removing these environmental hazards and making the workplace safer, we can help decrease health risk in Black communities to begin with. Additionally, the tobacco and alcohol industries specifically target the Black community, thus leading to greater illnesses caused by smoking and drinking, and death rates. So by ending the direct target of these substances to the Black community, we can help decrease use and therefore the unproportional effects of these substances on Black Americans. We can also expand insurance coverage so that everyone will have access to either employer or government-based insurance so that they can receive health care. And we can also just hold healthcare institutions responsible for eliminating institutional racism and hold healthcare practitioners responsible as well for providing culturally competent care. Through reading Dying While Black and discussing its shared and unique themes alongside those of Just Medicine, I have learned how deep-rooted issues such as inequity in healthcare actually are. I realize that I have to make a conscious effort to be aware of my own implicit biases and also understand the ways in which my complacency in working in a system that has historically and fundamentally discriminated against African Americans affects not only my future clients, but also the perpetuation of this system. So moving forward, I now feel more empowered to stand up against these injustices and better educated on how I can both provide more culturally competent care to each of my individual clients and how I can advocate for them on an individual and community level. And specifically as an occupational therapist, we look at each individual and how they're able to carry out meaningful activities and occupations. And if they feel that they can't receive proper health care or equal health care, that's a major issue and it's going to impact their lives on a really fundamental level in the sense that if they're not receiving quality health care or if they have health issues or if they feel unheard, that's going to affect how they feel physically and also mentally. And that's going to be a very big factor that I need to look at and be aware of and can help them overcome.
I'm grateful that all of my past experiences have provided me with many culturally diverse opportunities, although I was unaware just how deeply interconnected minority inequality is within our history, healthcare, and legal systems. After discussing Just Medicine and Dying While Black, I am beyond disturbed by these mistreatments. And as a white Jewish American woman, I personally have experienced some minor discrimination, but more so have become aware of what my own implicit biases are. Therefore, as a future occupational therapist, I plan to take my past experiences and further advocate for minority inequality in healthcare and specifically in treatment. In addition, I will continue to educate myself as well as others, as education and advocacy are the only way that change can happen. And I believe that everyone truly deserves the basic human rights to fair, equal, and ethical treatment.